government can't just take your life, can't just take your freedom, it can't just take your house. It can't do any of that just because it feels like it. That's what the Fifth Amendment says, and that's what due process means.
I have sworn upon the altar of God hostility against every form of terror over the mind of man. The essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. In the tyrants is obedience to God. Fields be frozen, the snow, no shoes on.
So welcome back to the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, John Tig Tigan. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about due process and equal justice under the law. We'll hit the Fifth Amendment, the promise that government can't just take your life, liberty, or property without fair process, you would think. But we'll look at the Sixth Amendment also, your right to speedy trial and impartial jury, and the chance to face your accuser if you can. Then I'll break down, how those protections are failing today with double standards, trial by media, and politicized prosecution. And I'll wrap it up, obviously, with the Tig's tip on how you and your family can, be ready if the system ever comes knocking. So let's jump into this. This is the Fifth Amendment due process. So this idea is old. It didn't start in 1776 with America. It started way back in the year 1215, over 800 years ago. So in England, King John sat on one side and a group of baron lords with armies stood on the other. So the king had been taxing them heavy. Kind of sounds familiar. So jailing men without trials and grabbing land. So the barons were fed up. They forced him to sign a charter called the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta said something a little bit new for those days. Even the king had to follow the law. So it said no free man could be thrown in prison or lose his property unless it was done by the law of the land. That was the seed. That one line planted the idea of due process, and the idea grew. So over centuries, English kings tried to get around it. Some used star chambers, where they held secret trials. We've heard this before. Others use general warrants to search anyone's house without reason, but Parliament and courts kept bringing the Magna Carta back up. They kept saying the king must follow the law. So let's fast forward to the 1700s. The American colonists saw British rulers abuse power. They saw governors seizing property. They saw soldiers, barging into houses and homes. They saw people punished without fair trials. Sounds like today still, but that's one of the reasons the colonists rebelled. They wanted protection. So when the founders wrote the Bill of Rights, they locked it in. They wrote, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that's the wall they built between the people and the government power. So some examples, look at how it worked out in 1856. The Supreme Court had a case called Murray. I'm trying to find all this stuff about Murray's Leases versus Hawberk Land and Improvement Company. Probably butchered that word, but oh well. So the government tried to take property without a fair process. So the court said the justice said due process protects against arbitrary action. So that means the government can't just act on a whim. So another example, eminent domain, which is bullcrap. But that's when the government takes land for public use, like building a road. The Fifth Amendment says if they take your land, they have to pay you fair value. Who picks the value? So that's just called compensation. We all know that. So you see it when a highway cut through neighborhoods, families lose homes, but the government has to pay, but not the price they should pay. But without due process, they could just take it for free. Another area, the death penalty. Due process protects life, supposedly. But states can't execute anyone unless all legal steps are followed. So that means, charges, a trial, appeals, full review. If the process is broken, sentences can be overturned. We've seen them overturned. But the Fifth also gives us the Miranda rights. So the Miranda rights, in 1966, the Miranda versus Arizona, man was questioned by police without being told his rights. The court said that violated due process. From then on, police have to say you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Well, that warning is due process in action. In 1970, there was another case, Goldberg versus Kelly. Poor families in New York had their welfare benefits cut off without a hearing. The court said no way. Even cutting off benefits required due process. So people must be heard before the government takes something away from you, supposedly. So due process doesn't just protect the rich. I disagree. But it also supposed to protect everyone, rich and poor. I disagree. But citizens or immigrants, I still disagree. I just talk. So a little bit more modern angle. Due process is still being tested every day. Take immigration, non-citizens can't just be deported without hearings. They should be, but courts say they get due process also. They must be able to stand before a judge, speak and present evidence before being removed, which if they got in here legally, but anyways, but this is our process, people. It is what it is, unfortunately. But let's look at Guantanamo Bay. After 9/11, the U.S. held detainees there without charges. And in 2008, the Supreme Court said, and I'm not even trying to say the other word, but another case, something versus Bush, that even foreign detainees had the right to challenge their detention in U.S. courts. So that due process reaching into the hardest cases. During COVID, some governors shut down whole sectors, churches, gyms, and small businesses left the box stores open. But lawsuits were flying around all over the place. People argued it violated due process. It shutdowns were ordered without fair rules. That's true. Some courts agreed, striking down bans on church gatherings. Others said public health justified it. The fight showed that due process still matters when rules are made fast. Technology is another front. Facial recognition. We're seeing it all over, especially airports. Surveillance cameras, secret watch lists. Turning Point USA is one of them. Charlie Kirk. But what happens if you're flagged by an algorithm as a suspect? Do you get a hearing? Do you get to face your accuser? These are due process questions for our digital age, right? So, even property fights continue. Intimate domain battles pop up all over the place when government want land for pipelines, airports, or redevelopment. Due process is what forces them to pay and prove public use. So due process isn't red tape. It isn't a loophole for criminals. It's the wall that keeps the government from becoming king. That it's the shield every American carries, whether you're rich or poor, powerful or unknown. Without it, we'd be back in the meadows of England, begging rulers to follow the law, but with it, we have freedom under law, not under men. That's the Fifth Amendment, and that's due process.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. That who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. We bled in the fields, we frozen.
So jumping into segment 2, I'm gonna go over the Sixth Amendment. So trials in America are not meant to be slow. January 6th. They're not meant to be secret. Yeah. And they're not meant to be stacked against you. That's why the Sixth Amendment exists. It gives you 5 promises: a speedy trial, a public trial, an impartial jury. Depends on where you live and who you are. The right to face your accuser, the right to a lawyer. So without these, a trial is not justice. It's punishment with paperwork. And I'm going to tell you right now, we don't have a justice system. It's a legal system. I'm going to go off my little script that I got, so it helps me keep on track. But, we know some of these things are not factual, but this is what the Sixth Amendment is a line. This is what it's supposed to do for. But anyways, so history. So back in England, kings used secret courts called star chambers, what I talked about a little bit earlier. So imagine this, you get pulled into a dark room, no jury, no lawyer. The judge works for the king. Kind of sounds like judges working for the Biden administration, but the charges are unclear. We've seen this. Punishment is already decided. We've seen this. You can't even face the person accusing you, kind of. But that was the star chamber. In my opinion, again, going off script again, because this is what I love to do. We saw what the Biden administration do, and they want to call Trump the king. The Democrats are the ones that want a king, and they act like they are the king. They want authoritarian rule. You know, that's what they want. They are the fascists. Keep calling them what they are. They are the fascists. They are the demonic, you know, they are the freaking Nazis. You know, don't let them get away with their lies, their labels. People say, oh, it's not a big deal. To me, it is a big deal because you're seeing it. Their rhetoric just got a person assassinated. So start stating the facts and don't be cowards, people. Just call it like it is. They are the fascists. I'm going to keep going. So the founders wanted none of that here. So they built the Sixth Amendment as a wall. It makes sure a trial is fast, fair, open, and honest. So number one, a speedy trial. The Constitution says trials must be speedy, except for January 6th. That means you shouldn't sit in jail for years, unless you're January 6th, without a verdict. So in the Baker versus Wingo, I'm going to screw all these names up, but in 1972, the Supreme Court gave us a test. Judges must ask, how long was the delay? Why was there a delay? And did the accused ask for a speedy trial? Did the delay hurt the defense? If the answer shows unfair delay, charges can be dropped. Modern example, January 6th. So the January 6th cases in Washington, D.C. show how fragile this right can be. Over 1,500 people were charged. The courts were flooded. Prosecutors had mountains of video, phone data, and documents to review. That took years. By the fourth anniversary in January 2025, nearly 500 cases were still open. About 300 defendants were still waiting for trial. Some had spent years in jail with no verdict. The Speedy Trial Act normally says trial should start in 70 days, but courts allowed delays, pointing to the huge case log, COVID shutdowns, and evidence piles. You know, they're bull crap. Judges said, I call them more kings, said those were good causes. Some defendants asked for delays themselves. That's on them then, hoping for pardons or new rulings. Others begged for faster trials, but were told the system was too backed up. To me, that's not an excuse, especially when the government themselves does it to themselves. We, the people, should not have to fucking suffer for it. Sorry for the word, but it's bullshit. But anyway, so in 1987, the Supreme Court ruled the United States versus Salerno that detentions before trial is allowed with safeguards, but in practice, many January 6 defendants sat in jail not because they were convicted, but because trials hadn't started. And they weren't really even violent. I mean, some of them were old freaking ladies that just walked into the Capitol, actually were greeted in as they walked in. I'm going to go on off script. So then on January 20th, 2025, President Trump pardoned many of them. That ended the cases. But the years they had to spend waiting show how the promise of a speedy trial can stretch until it breaks. I don't want to go, but it's bullcrap. The government causes the delay. They should be out in public. They should not be sitting in jail. Just because the government's stupid and they're handicapped, and they don't have the ability or the comprehension or the intelligence to get the things done properly and fast, they should be let out, especially if it's not a violent crime. Even if somebody pepper sprayed a cop, let them out. There's no reason for them to sit in jail that long when the government themselves did it to themselves. So number two, public trial. Trials must be open to the public, which we've seen it, and a lot of them are not, but that keeps judges and prosecutors honest. So in 1948, a man was convicted in secret. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. Trials must be open. Modern examples, during COVID, many courts used Zoom, but not everyone could log in. Some families couldn't watch. Some reporters were cut out. That raised real questions about whether those trials were truly public. I don't really know a whole lot about it. I'm just giving examples. I didn't look into it. But so impartial jury. Yeah. Tell that to Trump. So juries must be fair. They can't be stacked by rulers, which they are, especially in New York. Ramirez versus Louisiana in 2020, the court struck down laws allowing non-unanimous jury convictions. Now every jury in serious cases must be unanimous. So modern example, finding 12 fair jurors today is harder than ever. News, social media, political bullcrap that's going on. Judges work to weed those out, which I don't believe some of them do. Depends on where you're at. Try to weed out the bias, but in big cases, it's tough to find people who haven't actually already made up their minds. So yeah, obviously we've seen a lot of that. But the Supreme Court, again, it depends on who you are. the elite versus the rest of the people, it'll go to the Supreme Court fast and a lot of stuff will be overturned. Trump is a prime example. Number 4, so confront your accuser. So you get to face the people who accuse you. Pointer versus Texas. This happened in 1965. The court said you can't be convicted with testimony you can't challenge. So in Crawford versus Washington, 2004, the court said testimonial statements can't be used unless the witness shows up. That makes sense, right? Hearsay, kind of what's going on social media with me with other crap and 13 hours. But the Hemp Hill versus New York, 2022, the court said prosecutors can't sneak in hearsay just because the defendant opened the door. Another one, Samia versus United States, 2023. The court allowed a redacted confession from a co-defendant, but only if it didn't name the accused directly. So those are some examples, but what happens if your accuser is a computer? Facial recognition and AI now flag suspects by themselves. Social media is one of them. So how do you cross-examine a program? But what I find, courts are just starting to wrestle with that. So we'll see kind of what happens. I couldn't really dig into a whole lot of it. Tried. So it's just something that's going to be ongoing. So obviously you have a right to a lawyer if you don't have to face the government. So you don't have to face the government alone. But if you can afford your own attorney, I highly suggest you buy one. Some of these other ones, again, are kind of biased in a way. They won't really represent you the way they should. But anyway, so Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. A poor man named Clarence Gideon asked for a lawyer. The judge said no. He lost. The Supreme Court said every defendant has the right to an attorney, even if they can't pay. So here's some examples. Public defenders, which again, some, to be careful, today are overloaded. So some carry hundreds of cases because again, they're doing it for free. That means less time for each client. So while the right exists on paper, the practice is often it stretches very thin. But Trump's cases in New York, a gag order limited what Trump could say before trial. His lawyers argued it hurt his right to defend himself publicly, which I agree. Courts disagreed, but it shows how the Sixth Amendment is still central for today. COVID delays, the shutdowns tested the meaning of a speedy technology. Courts now face questions about remote witnesses, digital evidence, and AI. So January 6th, speedy trial. Again, I don't, this is just me again. If they're going to go and arrest that many people, which it'll probably happen again, may not be in our lifetime, especially if we stand up and fight back. But if the government themselves wants to go out and arrest 1,500 people and put the weight and the burden, and they did it to themselves, the people should not be staying in court. We, the people, should not be suffering for their stupidity. And honestly, for that one, just their political, pretty much they're all political prisoners anyways, in my opinion. So but anyways, so the Sixth Amendment is the people's firewall. It's supposed to be our firewall. So it says trials must be fast, fair, and open. It's obviously there's not supposed to be no secret trials except for Epstein, no rigged juries except for Trump, and no faceless accusers. So the standing alone against the state, you don't have to do that. You get an attorney, even though they're probably crap. So if you can afford one, buy one. But without the Sixth Amendment, a trial is punishment with paperwork. And that's all it is. So with justice, it has, again, I hate saying justice. That's why I'm kind of pausing, but I write this stuff out. But, it gives you a fighting chance in our legal system.
I have sworn upon the essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety, deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Fields be frozen, the snow.
Well, let's face it, equal justice in America is breaking down. The Fifth and Sixth Amendment supposed to promise fairness. They say no one should lose life, liberty, or property without due process. They say everyone gets a fair, speedy public trial, but today those promises have often been ignored, and they usually are. Politicized prosecution is one. Justice, is supposed to be blind, but it's not, in my opinion. The law should treat everyone the same, but that doesn't always happen. We've seen it. John Adams, one of our founders, said a republic must be a government of laws, not of men. That means rules apply to the same to everyone. I don't really know what else to explain, but it doesn't. But today, sometimes the rules bend depending on who you are. President Trump's cases. Trump faced multiple indictments in state and federal courts. The Supreme Court ruled a president has immunity for core official acts, but no immunity for private acts. Makes sense. But, the lower courts said no immunity at all. The Supreme Court said the law is more careful than that. I don't know why they did that, but in 2024, the Supreme Court also ruled on the obstruction law used in January 6th cases. Lower courts, read it too wide. The Supreme Court said it applies only if you mess with evidence. Kind of like what I said before, that changed charges for many of the defendants. In March of 24, the court stopped Colorado for kicking Trump off the ballot. They said only Congress, not states, can enforce that rule for federal offices. January 2025, the court refused to delay Trump's New York sentencing. They gave no reason, which is common for emergency orders. The trial judge gave him an unconditional discharge. No jail, no probation, no fine. But the appeal, obviously, we all know it's continuing. In 2022, the court also rejected the bid for a special master to review seized documents. The appeals court said the trial judge used the wrong legal test. Imagine that. So the case, shows a pattern. Lower courts sometimes use judgment shaped by opinion. The Supreme Court, it'll step in and correct the law, which it shouldn't have to. But, look at, there's some double standard. So look at the protests and riots in the past few years. In some cases, people got in the older cases, people got long prison sentences and harsh pretrial detention, but nowadays, in other cases, charges were completely dropped or reduced for the same kinds of acts. But obviously different results. Justice should not depend on the case you march for or the sign you carry. It shouldn't. Punishment should be equal across the book. But then delays in justice. The Sixth Amendment promises a speedy trial, but after COVID, courts backlogs exploded. Some states had thousands of pending cases. Defendants sat in jail for 2 or 3 years, mainly January 6th. Families of the victims waited just as long for closure. That is not speedy whatsoever. That is justice delayed, which is often means justice is denied. True justice. That's why I call it a legal system. Trial by media. In 1966, the Supreme Court decided Shepard versus Maxwell, Dr. Sam Shepard murder trial turned into a circus. Reporters crowded the courtroom. Headlines judged him guilty before the jury did. The court overturned his conviction. So today it's even worse. Social media spread leaks, videos, rumors before a trial even begins. So a hashtag can convict someone in public's mind, long before the jury even hears the evidence and the dude ends up being innocent. But judges, can move trials, sequester juries, or issue gag orders, but many don't. The result is trial by media, not by jury. Pretrial detentions and bail. In 1987, the Supreme Court decided United States versus Salerno. It allowed preventive detention, which some of us get, depends on what it is, holding a suspect before a trial, but only with strict safeguards. So in practice, thousands of Americans sit in jail today, not because they're dangerous, but because they can't afford. One person, posts bail and goes home. Another person charged with the same crime can't pay, it sits in jail for months. That is two systems of justice, one for the rich and one for the poor. Again, that's kind of when they came up with the whole bail is bond, but this is what happens when you do that. Don't get in trouble. That's all I got to say. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime. There's some, again, little racial disparities. Studies show that Black and Hispanic defendants often get higher bail and longer sentences than white defendants. That are charged with the exact same crime. I'm sorry. But that breaks the promise of equal protection. It should be the same. I didn't really look deep into it. It could be, somebody maybe he's got a longer crime history and stuff like that. I just didn't want to divulge into all that stuff. Just is what it is. Justice, it should be equal. It shouldn't really matter, honestly. But the COVID ruling with the due process put it way under fire. The pandemic brought sweeping orders. Churches closed, businesses shut down, schools locked, lawsuits, followed. And a lot of times the government lost. So the Roman Catholic, versus Cumio, Homo, whatever, in 2020, The New York capped church services at 10 people, but let big stores and casinos stay open. Supreme Court struck that down. They said it violated religious freedoms and due process. Again, I love how people on the left screams about separation of church and state until that happened. Tandon versus Newsom, 2021. California limited at-home worship while allowing other small gatherings. The court blocked that also. Business also sued after being forced to shut down while larger chains stayed open. Parents sued when schools closed for months. Court split on many of these cases. But the core question was always, were the rules fair? Did our leaders, I want to call them leaders, did our politicians skip due process? Hell yeah, they did. Just the modern crackdown in due process, you saw it. Assets forfeiture. Police can seize cars, cash, or property if they suspect a crime. Again, COVID, they could probably do it because you're committing crime under the government or over the governor's laws. Again, it wasn't even Biden or Trump. It was the local government that did this to us. So, but with, they did a lot of the stuff without even convicting the owner. I'll back. So again, the police can seize cars, cash, or property if they suspect a crime, often without even convicting the owner. Critics say this flips the process upside down, which it does. Surveillance and watch list, facial recognition, no-fly list, which is bullcrap. It should be raising questions for everyone. If the algorithm flags you, can you fight it? Can you face your accuser if your accuser is a computer? 2008, another Gitmo detainee. In 2008, Supreme Court ruled that the detainees at Gitmo, whatever, Bay had the right to challenge their detention in court. Even in national security cases, due process still matters. So be careful. And when people say, just send them to Gitmo, I kind of get it. We can't have a second rogue government, but I'm really tired of these illegals and even again national security people getting the exact same crap, same protection that we get. It should be modified differently. They should not be getting the exact same protection as a law-abiding U.S. citizen. Again, I'm not talking those illegals who come in here illegally should not get the exact same protections. That's just me. That's my opinion. And the same with these terrorists that are being captured on the battlefield. They should not be getting the exact same protection that we get. But anyways, that is what it is. Welcome to the United States. So when the law is applied by politics, headlines, or money, it's not law anymore. It's power. Wearing a mask. It's what it is. It's just power wearing that mask. The founders gave us due process to stop that. But if we don't defend it, the words on paper are going to mean nothing. If justice only applies to your enemies, then justice is already dead. So stand up.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of terror over the mind of man. Essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
So here's a little practical patriot skill for the week. If you want to do it, build a family due process binder, kind of help yourself out. So, build a process binder, think of it as your another go bag for paperwork. If you or your loved one are detained, hospitalized, or caught in a legal fight, this binder, kind of keeps your family ready. So first step, get a sturdy binder or a folder. Maybe one that zips shut, closes, or locks is even better. Add identifications, make copies of birth certificates, driver's license, passports, social security cards. Then you want to add some health and insurance info, include medical cards, health insurance policies, a list of prescriptions. If you have prescription, add legal contacts, write down the names and numbers of at least one defense lawyer, and one family member and one trusted friend as an emergency contact. 5, add key legal papers. If you have power of attorney forms, medical consent forms, or wills, put copies in there. 6, write clear instructions on one page, spell what to do first. So this is what I would say. Call the lawyer, call your family, let them know where to find cash, cards, or the keys. Then, number 7, store it in a safe, but unknown. Keep it in a fireproof box. Tell your spouse or your kids where it is. Just simple stuff. Go back, rewind it, listen to it a little bit better. The binder turns, panic into action. It's going to give your family the tools to fight back if government power comes knocking. Build it as soon as you can. Try to build it this week. Don't wait till it's too late. Just do it. It's that simple. So I'm going to jump right into Tig's tip. This is a little gear accountability drill. So you want your personal trauma kit. So it's really simple. So check your gear. If you carry it, you're responsible for it. So you want to lay it out. Firearms, just unload them safely. So lay out your firearm, your magazine, your holster, your flashlight, say first aid kit, any other daily carry gear on a table. Again, make sure the firearm is clear before touching anything. Do a function check. Does the slide cycle? Is it smooth? Are your sights tight? Is the chamber clean? Magazines, are the springs working? Are the cracks or dents? Fully loaded. Again, just things to check. Flashlight, batteries, do you fresh? Are the bulbs working? Do you have a backup bulb? Do you have backup batteries for it? Your first aid kit. Trauma, you have some trauma items, they don't always have to be sealed. Maybe put them in a Ziploc bag versus the original package. So it's a little bit easier to rip open or whatever. You can leave them in the original package. Again, it's your trauma kit. Just make sure it's clean. It's not too far outdated, kind of things that, you want in your personal trauma kit. Every kit should cover bleeding, breathing, simple care until EMS arrives, So, pack these. These are a few items you should pack. A tourniquet, that's to stop heavy bleeding on arms, legs. Pressure bandage, that's for large gaping wounds. A chest seal, this is for something that's penetrating. So have have a two-sided, have multiple, because you just don't know where or what kind of injury it could be. So you want air to be able to come out but not go in. So you want to have a seal on the exit wound as well. So just kind of things to think about. So hemostatic gauze, that's like quick clot stuff. It's to pack deep wounds. Protective gloves. That way if you're helping with others, you have some kind of latex or whatever gloves. Trauma shears to cut things off fast. They'll cut shoes off fast as well. A marker. Markers are always nice, especially if you apply a tourniquet. You can mark the time you applied the tourniquet. It's optional, but good. Other things, optional, but good. Space blanket for shock, another small flashlight, some duct tape. Check your holster, see if it's secure. Does it hold the weapon firmly? Are there any cracks or loose screws? Your belt, does it sag? Do you need a new belt? Upgrade if needed. First aid kit, is it mounted? Where can you grab it fast? Practice pulling it off with one hand. A lot of people, you don't try that. You put it in the middle of your back, you can't even get to it. So, do a quick little dry run. Draw your empty weapon, fire 5 times, slow and safe, reholster each time. Then practice pulling your tourniquet, your gloves or bandage, and put them on. Whatever you can do from your kit. You can do it with one hand. Can you do it with one hand? That's the ultimate test, is doing things with one hand. So, don't wait until the fight or the accident to find out if your gear works. If your kit is broken, check it, fix it, stock it, be ready. It's that simple. Freedom doesn't survive by accident. It survives when ordinary people stand up, prepare, and pass the truth to the next generation. So don't wait for the system to hand you justice. Know your rights, train your skills, and hold the line for your family and your community. It's that simple. It's really not that difficult. So kind of knocking this thing down. So I'll leave you with by scripture, and obviously we'll close with the prayer. But Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the gift of justice written into your word and into our founding documents. Help us to stand for truth, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. Give us the wisdom to prepare, courage to speak, strength to defend the rights you give us. Bless our families, protect our communities, and guide this nation back to you. In Jesus' name, amen. So this is the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, John Tig Tigan. Never let a lie go unchallenged, and always move forward.
Brothers met brothers on the lines, the last flame we rose from the